As you go about speaking with people and collecting information and insights, you're going to need some tools to help organize and process this information, kind of like what we did in the last module with the desk research. So we're going to discuss 3 tools today, kind of 3.5. I'm going to throw one in at the end. The first is stakeholder mapping, the second is asset mapping, and the third is systems mapping. And stakeholder mapping and asset mapping are actually a form of systems mapping. They're kind of more limited, finite aspects of it, and systems mapping is putting it all together. And I'm going to explain to you exactly what I mean. So let's start with stakeholder mapping. This starts even before you talk to people. It's part of how you figure out who to talk to, and then you keep updating it as you go. Now, what does stakeholder mean? It means anyone who influences or is influenced by the work that you're trying to do. So anyone who has a stake, that's why it's called stakeholder. It means they might have something to gain or they might have something to lose. They might help you design and implement your ideas, or they might get in your way. So an easy way to start out with stakeholder mapping is to just start by listing all the people who interact with this challenge, kind of like what we did in the first video. And then ask yourself how they might interact with a potential solution. And then as you approach them, the way we discussed, as you proceed to talk to them, and you might start formulating ideas, you'll get a sense of who is going to be supportive, antagonistic, neutral, or yet to be determined. So you'll start to understand who you really need to have on board, who you might partner and collaborate with, and who you need to at least keep informed and keep in communication with. So different stakeholders will play different roles. And there's many different ways to map out your stakeholders. There's no one template you have to use. You can keep a list with notes, you can make a table, or you can group them by level of interest and influence or power. So this is one example of how to group stakeholders by level of influence and interest. And like I said, stakeholder mapping and analysis continues at every step and stage of your social change journey. You're always going to come back to it. You'll need to keep asking yourself both what role each stakeholder can play in creating the social change you set out to create, and also what effect the change will have on them. So it goes both ways. Asset mapping can happen once you've had a good number of conversations and are starting to get an idea of what you have to work with. So asset mapping is an exercise where you identify different forms of community capital. Community capital means the resources and strengths in a given community. This can include a whole bunch of different things. So in this visual, you'll see an example of the types of capital you might find, such as human capital, which means the individual characteristics in your community, social capital, which means the bonds, relationships, and networks between those individuals, cultural capital, which speaks to the heritage and tradition and history of this community, political capital, which means how people in the community organize themselves, govern themselves. So it could talk about institutions. And then financial capital, which refers to income and wealth and investment in this community. You can also have natural capital, which refers to natural resources and ecosystems, and built capital, like infrastructure, roads, buildings, etc. And this illustration of the different kinds of capital has been adapted from a framework for evaluating strategic interventions, which is called the Community Capitals tool. And it was developed by a group of community research based on their analysis of entrepreneurial communities. So they observed that communities who were successful in sustainable development addressed and incorporated all the different types of capital that they could in their work. So asset mapping helps you identify available resources and evaluate what resources you'll need. And like stakeholder mapping, it can take many different shapes and forms. You can just make a bullet list, a table, or a diagram like this illustration. And this illustration is only one depiction of the kinds of assets that you might find in a given setting. All right, next it's on to systems mapping. So a system includes assets, stakeholders, institutions, and the relationships between them. And we talked about systems thinking in the last module, right? We mentioned that how important it is to understand that each and every social or environmental challenge is part of a complex web of factors and stakeholders that are interrelated. So everything you do is going to affect and be affected by the relationships that exist between these factors and stakeholders. And what you really want to do in social change is find ways for existing stakeholders to work better together and to understand that you're not working in a vacuum. So it's really important to first start by understanding the system. And that's what systems mapping is. It means defining and understanding the system you're working in. So part of that is defining the boundaries of the system. Like, what am I talking about? What is the system? Is it the U.S. healthcare system? Is the Bangladesh education system? It can be something very local. It could be even something global. You want to identify the players in that system and understand the relationships between those players and the factors affecting those relationships. And here's where it really does help to draw out a diagram. You can't really do systems mapping with like a bullet list. You can even use a software to create a systems map. I'm going to end on this one last visual tool that I really like to use just when thinking to myself about the underlying dynamics in any given system or community. And it's called an iceberg model. I came across it on the Donella Meadows website that I mentioned in the last module. And it helps you think about observable events, which are really the tip of the iceberg, in terms of the underlying patterns, structures, and mental models beneath them. So in facing this challenge and facing this huge iceberg, it really helps to realize that, the events you see are really only what's above the surface, and you have to immerse yourself to understand the bulk of the challenge which lies beneath the surface. As you can tell, I really love these tools that help us visualize and understand the human and societal dimensions beneath these complex challenges we're dealing with. And you can use them in collaboration with the people you're talking to. You can have like team meetings or workshops to try to do systems mapping and asset mapping and stakeholder mapping and think about the iceberg diagram. And there are many others out there. So I'm sharing them with you not to give you more work, but because if you're going to go out there and have all these conversations, it helps to have a way of pulling it all together as you take steps towards identifying pathways to change. So you can feel free to use any one of these or all of them or others you may come across, and they'll help you link your understanding of the problem to your understanding of potential solutions, and most importantly, who you'll need to work with to design and implement those solutions. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts of talking to people. So as you set out there and start with one-on-one interviews and then potentially start talking to people in different groups, there's so much to keep in mind about hearing all voices, about demonstrating respect, and about building trust.